Go anywhere in the world and you will find a wide selection of alcoholic drinks, from light and fizzy to complex and sophisticated. Yet only a special few can boast the unique combination of natural flavors, simplicity, and the capacity to conquer the hearts and tongues of millions. One such drink is Scotch Whisky. On our personal journey, we set out to learn why Scotland is so fiercely proud of its national drink. So, we met with the very people producing Scotch whisky and tried to understand the dedication and passion involved in the art of distilling, as well as how Scotland's rough and magnificent nature affects its production, and what whisky means to the many who enjoy a wee dram.
Good afternoon, my name is John Fordyce and I am one of the co-founders and directors of the Borders Distillery, which is the first distillery to work in the Scottish Borders since 1837. The last one closed in Kelso, and we've come back after 180 years to start off again. I think the answer to the question of what is Scotch whisky in a wider sense I think is the same question as what is wine in a wider sense, or what is Arak from Ceylon, Sri Lanka in a wider sense, what is Baijiu in China. These things are a function of the place where they're made, and they're a function of the culture of the people that make them, and they're a really big way of people talking and connecting with each other. So if you're drinking Scotch whisky in Australia that's been made in Scotland, then there's a connection. If you're drinking in Beijing, there's a connection. Likewise, if you're drinking French wine in Scotland, or Australian wine in Scotland, or you're drinking Baijiu in Brazil, these are ways of connecting people and it's a social phenomenon. People make things, we talk about provenance, we talk about terroir, we talk about things. It's important that people know where things come from. And the great thing about Scotch whisky is it can only come from Scotland. The industry is composed of globally important businesses and little tiny businesses, but everything's in Scotland. So no matter where you are in the world, if you're drinking a bottle of Scotch, you know it's been made in Scotland. And I think that's probably what the bigger picture is.
My name is Graham Alexander and I am a tour guide at the Tobermory Distillery. I'm passionate about whisky, and this is the 5th oldest distillery in Scotland, founded in 1798. I think Scotland is known for a number of things. Top of the list would probably be whisky, our kilts, our bagpipes, our poet Sir Rabbie Burns. Those are the things people associate with Scotland, but also we have the most magnificent wildlife, mountains, and beautiful supplies of water. The water is different in different parts of Scotland. Our water on this island falls from the sky, and it comes down from a loch, down a river, down a waterfall, through a dam, straight into the distillery. It's as fresh as the day it fell from the sky. It's not treated, and like everything, it's a contributory factor to the beauty of the end product. There's no one size fits all in the world of whisky. Within the framework, everybody does little subtly different things. Even the containers that we ferment in, the washbacks as they're called, they're made of beautiful wood. Okay, they could be stainless steel, but there's something in the wood will contribute towards the character of the whisky. There's something in the wind, something in the rain, something in the air that just makes it such a special drink and so closely associated with Scotland.
My name's Drew Mackenzie Smith. I'm the founder and managing director of Lindos Abbey Distillery, and I also have the pleasure of being the custodian of Lindos Abbey itself. I sort of first got into the whisky. The reason that we're here now is I enjoy whisky. I'm not a huge expert, but I've been led, luckily, by experts who've helped me for the last 20 years get to where we are now and establish a distillery at what is widely regarded as a spiritual home of Scotch whisky. And it's an honour and a privilege to be the founder of such a place. Scotland's nature's role is perfectly honed after 150 plus years, in that whilst I was talking about innovation, it's great there's lots of innovation, but equally sometimes there's a reason that things are the way they are. For instance, dunnage warehousing, that works. And that's worked for 100 odd years, so this is why we use it. And Scotland's climate is perfectly suited to that. So it's warm, it's damp, then it's wet for longer than it's warm. And that's, over the centuries, what people have realised is the best temperature, best climate for making whisky. Our barley, as you've mentioned, is all from Fife. Our water comes from a borehole right next to the distillery. So I suppose what I really like, and it's not just Lindos, it's nearly all the other distilleries as well, we're making whisky the same way that people did for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the beauty of whisky as a product is it is literally just water, barley and yeast. And that hasn't changed. So here we are at Lindos making whisky under the same sunshine, barley's grown in the same soil, water comes from the same water source, so nothing's changed. And that's why it's such a spectacular industry to be in. But all the distilleries in Scotland have the same ingredients, yet we produce, I think at the last count there's 120 distilleries, I think, all producing a different single malt. So that's fantastic. It's not coming out of huge factories or anything like that. Each one is different, and good luck to them.
When we opened on the 1st of March, it was during a weather spell here called the Beast from the East. So it was -9 outside. So the first thing you do when you start up is you set off the boiler. So we started up the boiler, but we weren't drawing steam. So the boiler vented, but it vented into -9 degree air. And so there's an enormous cloud appeared above the distillery of steam. But the people who live above us, on the road above us, thought it was the fire. So we're all crawling around with hair dryers trying to unblock valves because they're frozen up. And all of a sudden there's this big stomp, 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 stop, and the entire fire brigade comes rushing around the building, think the place is on fire. And we hadn't even fired up the stills at that stage. And we'd had a 999 call about the distillery being on fire. We'd had the entire fire brigade here. We'd bought 4 hair dryers from the local supermarket to unblock the valves. So the first day in itself was quite exciting, and it's been exciting ever since. Yeah.
The first time I tried Scotch whisky, I would have been in the early 60s. I was born in the early 50s, and I remember sneaking into my father's cupboard, and there was a bottle of whisky there. There really wasn't much available in those days. It was a blended whisky. I can't remember what make it was, but I do remember it tasting a little bit of caramel and really not very nice. Yet compare that with the wonderful finishes you can get on whiskies today, and some of the finishes we put on our whiskies are simply glorious. It's a very, very different drink today.
So I think I probably tried Scotch for the first time in January of 1994, I remember, up in the Highlands. My first impressions were I was surprised at how complicated it was. I was expecting fiery spirit, and instead I got this kind of subtle, complex sensation.
The very first time wasn't a great experience, if I'm honest. I was fishing with my father and a gilly when I was approximately about 14 years old, and it was a great day salmon fishing for a young chap being out. It was very exciting. And at the end of the day, my father and the gilly were enjoying a dram, and I suppose, like most teenagers, nagged to have some, and they very kindly gave me some whisky, which I think was Macallan, if I remember back on it. And I think they both sat back because they knew what was going to happen, and they said, it's okay, you can water it down a little bit. I ended up with probably 90% water, 10% whiskey, because it's the only way I could drink it as a 14-year-old, and it was obviously quite revolting. So that was the first time I had it, but in a way, what the nicest thing is, about 10 years after that, I was with my father again, and the same gilly, and we were fishing, and we had a dram again, and by that time I really did appreciate it. So it was quite a nice, it was quite the same loch, to go back to revisit it. And we weren't revisiting it just so I could have a dram, we were visiting to have a good day's fishing. But it's always stuck with me that first experience wasn't great, but the second time round, fantastic.
Okay, so in terms of making the whiskey here, we set out with a specific objective. We were looking to make a whiskey that would be aromatic, quite fruity, sort of accessible. We wanted to do it, so we designed the distillery behind that idea of our spirit. Then we checked on the water situation. So we have amazing water in Hawick. There's no, what you're worried about as a distiller is a lot of nitrates, a lot of manganese, or a lot of iron. And we don't have any of those elements in our water here. Then we're looking for the next ingredient, which is barley. So all of our barley is grown in the Scottish borders by people who have for many, many years provided barley to the Scotch whisky industry. It's malted in Berwick by Simpsons, then it's stored for us just down the road, and a man called Keith brings it every Monday morning. So that works nicely. Yeast, we've stuck to the standard. We just use a thing called Pinnacle AB, distiller's yeast like everybody else. So then what you're looking for is what kind of spirit are you getting? And there are three processes, if you like. First of all, you want to make sure there are no defects. So when you nose it in a dilute form, there are no off notes. Then you want to find out, are you getting it, is it nice and fruity at the front? And in our case, we're quite interested in having sort of a bit of a dry back flavor, if you see what I mean. And that informs our choice of barrels. And we're going for a mixture of bourbon first fill and bourbon refill. And we think that our type of spirit with that type of barrel will match to make in an X number of years' time the whiskey we want. But of course we don't know, because nobody's matured whiskey in the Scottish borders for 180 years. Nobody's made whiskey for 180 years. So we're relying on what we understand in terms of quality and production. We're relying on buying high quality casks. And to a certain extent, we're relying on the accumulated expertise within the Scotch whisky industry. So, you know, with only 3 ingredients and everybody making the same stuff, there's an area of agreement or consensus on what makes a good Scotch whisky in the end.
Scotch whisky in a deeper sense is so embedded in history. The history not only of Scotland, but the history of the whole of the United Kingdom, and of course France, with whom Scotland always had a very close alliance. I love the image of King James IV in 1494, giving orders for a monk, Friar John Core at Lindos Castle, to make spirit out of barley mash. There's something about that that just forms history. and the fact the king referred to it as the aqua vitae, the water of life, and the Gaelic language, ushkabar, the water of life. There's something about it that has inspired so much of Scotland's history, and that, of course, has reached across the world.
We don't really know everything about how whisky was made from the first recorded day, which is in 1494. So it was a monk that wrote a receipt, a guy called Friar John Core. Up until about 1909, I think it could have been made in any number of ways. But in 1909, the British government decided that we had to have a regulated way of making Scotch to give consumers guarantee. So we had what were called the Scotch Whisky Orders, and they're from 1909. And they were updated 100 years later in 2009, and that is currently the system that we use on. And the rules are very basic. So you may only use 3 ingredients: barley, yeast, and water. You may only mature in oak, and you may not call it Scotch whisky until it's been in the casks for 3 years, roughly 1,000 days. So those are the governing regulations. They haven't really changed for 100 odd years. Before that, I think there would have been many, many ways of making Scotch whisky, some better than others.
Well, whisky production has gone back, whilst ours goes back to 1494, the actual distillation goes back millennia before that. And the monks here, our product is aqua vitae, which is what is recorded in the Exchequer roll. And what they were doing was distilling barley. And our monks came from France, and most of the distillation across Europe came from the monasteries, where they picked up the skill from. Maybe it was travels, it was China, you name it. Distillation goes way back to the roots of mankind in a sense. But as far as Lindos is concerned, we know there was certainly brewing here way before 1494, but obviously, again, the reason we're all sitting here now is the Exchequer roll of 1494 recording to Friar John Core 8 bowls of malt wherewith to make aqua vitae for King James IV. And what the historians have worked out is 8 bowls of malt is enough to make, of today's whisky, about 1,500 bottles. So it wasn't just a one-off thing, it was obviously quite a production line. I think Scotland's role is crucial. I think there's some fantastic whiskies coming from all around the world. We've had visitors from Japan. We have the honour of having a Curiachito from Chichibu. We've had all sorts of people coming here. I also think, though, the Scotch whisky industry was slightly caught out, like the French were with their wine. They were sitting on their laurels for a very long time, and everyone adored Scotch whisky. And so the world whiskies did slightly take us by surprise, and Cavalan winning best whisky for a couple of years, I think made people sit up and take notice. So I think it energized the Scotch whisky industry. I think they realized that, come on, we can't just rely on our fantastic reputation, we have to innovate as well. But I think we'll never really be too troubled, because what we have is hundreds of years of history. I mean, we're talking about Lindos and 500 years, but the actual real industry has 100 years plus of expertise and reputation. So whilst it's good to see these other whiskies coming from, I mean, even dare I say England is producing decent whiskey, Wales, you name it, Australia, Tasmania. So whilst we're confident that Scotch whisky will always be the world leader, it doesn't do us any harm to think there's people snapping at our heels. And for little small outfits like Lindos, I applaud the Diageos and the Edringtons and the Bacardis for trailblazing, breaking into China, etc. And we can benefit from that. So carry on the good work.
My goodness, that's a difficult question. I think my favourite story about Scotch whisky is probably the way it is capable of bringing people together at things like when we celebrate Scotland's national poet, Robert Burns, all over the world on the same day, and the drink that's always taken at that meal is always Scotch whisky, and I think those are my favourite kind of moments to do with Scotch. Yeah.
I could do you a historical story about Jenny Geddes, if you like. She was an Edinburgh maidservant. It was the 23rd of July, 1637, and she was carrying her stool, walking rather unsteadily, having consumed rather more whisky than was perhaps good for her. she was on her way to St Giles Cathedral, obviously in a very cross mood because she was going to hear the Dean of the Cathedral preaching for the very first time on the orders of King Charles I to the heathen people of Scotland from the Book of Common Prayer. Scotland wanted none of it. Jenny was not allowed to sit in the pews with the good, the great, the high and the mighty. She rather unsteadily went into the cathedral, whereupon as the Dean started to preach, she chucked her stool at him. This caused a riot. The cathedral had to be evacuated. The troops were called out. No one knows what happened to Jenny that fateful day, but it was one of the acts that indirectly led to the execution of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the English Civil Wars, the execution of Charles I, and the rule of Oliver Cromwell. How history could have been different if Jenny had gone to church as a sober woman.
Scotch whisky is the only product that is a country and a product. So you can be in Australia, you're drinking Scotch, you're thinking of Scotland. So for the Scottish diaspora who's scattered all around the world, I think it links them all back. You know, as I said earlier, there's fantastic Australian, Tasmanian, all sorts of whiskies, but Scotch is Scotch and it's known around the world. So for us to be at the kind of epicenter is fantastic. And as I mentioned, we're getting visitors from all around the world. So I think Scotch is, it's bigger than just the country. It's our biggest marketing tool, and we should remember that sometimes. You know, when we sort of dismiss it a little bit, and people love gin, people love vodka, and have every right to do so. But Scotch is at the heart of that, and I suppose what I feel is that aqua vitae is at the epicenter of the epicenter. So aqua vitae is obviously water of life, Usquebar, whiskey. So not only have we resurrected the spiritual home of Scotch whisky, our product is going right back to the roots of it. And if we can share that with the whiskey drinking world, well, then we'll have done something right.
So if I was to present our whiskey in the future to the president of some unknown country that had never drunk whiskey, what would I say? Well, I think I would end up focusing on the quality of what we've made. So I would like him to look at it, to see the clarity of the spirit. I'd like him to smell it, to understand the complexity of the aromas. Then I'd like him to drink it slowly and appreciate it. And we'll just keep on talking about how we make it, why it's important the way we make it, and that really is, at the end of the day, he's enjoying sort of a fantastic achievement in making alcoholic drink, which is Scotch whisky.
I would challenge him that I could tell him a fact or two that he would never have heard of before. I would challenge him that even if he said he didn't like whisky, that he would go away absolutely loving it with a bottle in his hand. And I would challenge any preconceived prejudices about the whole world of whisky. I would put my arm around his shoulder and share a dram.
The distillery is fantastic. It's great to do a tour around here, but the Abbey ruins themselves is where the real history lies. So we'd share a dram in the ruins, talk about the world. If he's very, very lucky and very important, I might even show him my fire pit, and we'll enjoy a second dram. The
relationship between the distillery and the island, and particularly Tobermory, is one that is very close. The islanders hold this distillery very close to their heart. And events that happened between the 18th and 19th century, when the Highlands and Islands underwent the clearances and thousands of people were going to places like Canada, Australia, America, means that we reach out. We get so many visitors here who trace their ancestry back to this island and other parts of Scotland. In Canada, the Tobermory was named after us. Calgary City, named after our little settlement of Calgary. The Australians maintain the Lachlan Macquarie Mausoleum in honour of his services to Sydney. So for a little island, we reach across the world. People come here almost on pilgrimages, and the distillery is a big, big part of that. It's a huge part of the island culture.
with so many new distilleries, with 126 distilleries at the last count, there will be overheating, I think. I genuinely wish every new distillery good luck. There's no reason why I wouldn't, and I know a lot of the people behind them, and we have a great time, and I hope each and every one will survive. But I suppose what's always been the case is everyone needs their USP. Everyone needs to be different from their neighbours, and that's never changed for years and years and years. Obviously, where we're very lucky, very privileged, is we have the USP of being the spiritual home of Scotch whisky. Now, I know there's lots of other places that could be the spiritual home of Scotch whisky, and everywhere's entitled to say that. We don't have a copyright or a trademark, but most of our visitors that's how they feel. So when Michael Jackson said it's a pilgrimage to come here, that's what really made us the spiritual home of Scotch whisky.
Well, in the early days, of course, being an island distillery, all the whisky produced on the islands would by their very nature be peaty and smoky. Peat was the fuel of many of the islands. My understanding is that when the distillery reopened, it had a long closure between 1930 and 1972. Experimentation was made to do a very unique thing, and that was to produce your peaty, smoky whisky in one run of the year, and then side by side produce a beautiful, unsmoky whisky, a zesty, fruity whisky. And the experiment clearly worked because we were unique, and we still are relatively unique in being able to do that. And then, of course, the barrelling of the whisky, that's where the real business of the texture, the flavour and the colour comes in. And we use American bourbon barrels, and our whisky matures in barrels for 10 years minimum. And what a difference that makes to the end product.
I'm very excited about the way whisky consumption is moving in the world. I think the cocktail thing's interesting. I think we're no longer, it's not just a male drink in the pub now. A lot of women in whisky, making whisky, selling whisky, distributing whisky, financing whisky and consuming whisky, which I think is very exciting. And as the market grows, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, in Africa and Latin America, I think we're going to see a lot more diversity in consumption.
For me, in terms of having a dram of whisky, I would first of all just sip it and savour the taste. Let the taste explode inside you, and then I would add just a few drops of water. I wouldn't drown it, I would just add a few drops of water to release the oils and more flavours. What I wouldn't do, ever, is I would not mix it with lemonade, Coca-Cola or anything else, just a few drops of natural water.
I do think it happens to go very well with some food. Chocolate is a fantastic company to whisky. I think it goes very well with some cheeses, hard cheeses, especially sheep's cheese. I think it's a fantastic accompaniment. Obviously goes brilliantly well with haggis because you pour it on the haggis, so it's a natural. The aperitif market is massive, so the world's biggest market for Scotch whisky in volume terms is France, largely consumed as an aperitif. Consumed a lot in the UK as a digestive, if you like, but we have the Scottish cocktail, of course, which is a half and a half, so a bit of whisky and a half a pint of beer, which is drunk after work. A bit like you might have a Campari soda on the way home in Italy, you'd have a half and a half here. So it's enjoyed in an infinite variety of ways, but mostly what it has in common in most places is its sharing. So people tend to drink it with each other, with their friends, or at a party, or at a meal. It's a kind of a sharing drink, and I think that's the main thing that defines Scotch whisky as a drink, is that it's great for sharing.
People develop all sorts of rituals and habits when it comes to the pouring and drinking of whisky. I think it's very much a question of what you are comfortable with. Certainly, one of the things you'd want to do is use your sense of smell and observation. What is the colour, the texture of the whisky? Where has it been matured? In what sort of barrel has it been matured? And that will inform you of the sort of taste experience you can expect. So we have lots of whiskies at this distillery that have come out of their bourbon casks and, for example, been finished in wine casks, sherry casks, port casks. And that's why all the different colours, textures and flavours appear. I would use my sense of smell, my sense of observation, and then I would just I would spin it round in the glass because it's quite an oily texture, and then I would take my sip and enjoy.
I quite often get asked what's the big motivation or what's the reward at the end of the story for this. So, and I sort of answered by saying, well, we love building it, we loved starting it up, we've loved hiring and training people, but at the end of the day, what we want to get to is if a lot of people appreciate what we've made and put in a bottle. If we can get that, then it'll all have been worthwhile. It'll all be ready to do again somewhere else. That would be a fantastic achievement. If you're in food and drink and you're making things that other people are going to eat or drink, if they enjoy them, then you've done your job well.
I get lots of rewards from, I suppose, owning a distillery. I get a pleasure every day. We're beginning to start to look for accolades for actual physical awards for the Aqua Vitae and the building. In fact, just 3 days ago, we were awarded 5 stars for the visitor centre. So on a physical level, that's fantastic. It's recognition. And to get 5 stars when we've not even over for a year is a great thing. But I suppose the real reward for me is looking back, not just on the 20 years I've been doing it, but looking all the way back to when great-granddad bought the place, to think, well, by doing this, we can keep it in the family for another 100, 200 years. And especially, we were talking earlier, and when we were wondering about, I showed you the drawing we have of the monastery. So when we built the distillery, it was on the farmsteading, but we had to carry out an archaeological dig first for obvious reasons. And we had to dig some trenches. And Rebecca, our archaeologist, was very keen, she was very enthused. And on about day 1, she came in very excited, said, we found a wall. And it was a wall that no one's seen for 500 years. And it was really clean-cut sandstone, so it was really fantastic seeing it, and it was very exciting. Except she kept coming in saying we found more walls. And whilst it was exciting, I was getting a bit worried because we needed to build a distillery. And then what we had to do is record every single wall and preserve it with sand and then cover it over again. So to do that was a huge privilege to me. But what it did mean is for the first time in 500 years, we could see what the actual abbey looked like. When the dissolution of the monasteries came in around 1600, the abbey was no longer, and there's no pictures of it, nothing exists. So to get the archaeologist, an expert in Tyrrhenensian monasteries, and an illustrator into a room and lock the door and say, right, you're not coming out until we get this picture, was a real thing for me. So we now have this lovely, huge 10-foot by 10-foot image of what Lindos looked like. And I suppose for me personally, it's not a huge value or anything like that, but to think that on my watch, we did that, so people from generations hence will now be able to see what Lindos Abbey looked like. And so obviously we want the whisky to win awards, we want the visitor centre to win awards, but that will go down in history, that the people that visit here will now see what Lindos looked like.
My passion started about 10 years ago. I began to suddenly realise that there was more to whisky than met the eye, and that there were some super malt whiskies about. I started coming to Mull as a visitor, quite a long time ago, and every time I would come to this distillery, and every time I came here, I would taste something different that really inspired me to learn more about whisky and to understand it's not just this caramelly, horrible drink. It is a drink absolutely superb, beats any brandy, beats cognac, beats vodka, dare I say it, a brilliant drink.
One of the things I really like is that through creating this place, it not only is my dream come true, but we're helping the village. And I was mentioning earlier that we're getting visitors from all around the world. A few weekends ago I looked at the book and there was people from 13 different countries have visited in that 24-hour period. So if I'm having a dram, you know, you don't want to sit and get too complacent because there's still a lot of hard work and it costs a lot of money, and there's pleasure in employing 41 people, but there's also pressure because they're all good kids, everyone's working hard, and I suppose that's on my shoulders to keep them in employment. So I think of lots of things when I'm having a dram, but probably this is the central point of it.
I use it to reflect on the day. If I have a dram in the evening, it would be to weigh up the day, what went well, what didn't go so well, what would I have done differently, what am I going to do tomorrow. I use it really as a tool for reflection.
You probably won't be surprised to hear that I enjoy all whisky. Not only Scotch whisky, but I really appreciate American whisky, Japanese whisky. There's some really good stuff happening at the moment in Scandinavia. There's some interesting stuff coming out of Taiwan, Tasmania. You know, I mean, it'll be Tibet soon, I'm sure. So I like whisky all around. Within the stuff that we make, I probably, on balance, would drink more blend than malt because I like drinking it in highballs, and it's blended whiskey is very good with highballs. But I'm really quite happy as long as I got a glass of whiskey and I'm with friends. I'm perfectly happy, really.
For me, it sounds a bit bizarre. I love having bonfires. I always have, all my life I love having bonfires. So especially when the build was happening, there's lots of wood. There's a bit of the Abbey ruins, which in its heyday was the clock tower, but it's now my bonfire pit. And there's almost 2 or 3 times a week. I just love having bonfires. And so I suppose it's become a bit of like my man den, except it's outside. And so I have a ritual, if you like. I'll build up all the stuff for the bonfire, get it all going, and then have a dram as I watch the flames. And I think the kids think it's a bit weird, but I just love it. It's a thing that even when we're now open to the public, I kind of wait till everyone's gone home. And then most nights of the week, you'll see smoke coming up from Lindos. And luckily for me, I suppose, over the years, I've amassed quite a whisky collection, not because I'm a collector, not because I'm an expert, but a lot of it was genuinely, it sounds corny, was research. And here we are in the Legacy Bar with 30 super whiskies from the Scotch Whisky Society, so I have plenty of whiskies for me to try on my bonfire. So I wouldn't very often go to a pub and drink whiskey. If I do, I'm one of the old-fashioned Scots people that would have a half and a half. So you have your whiskey and a half pint of heavy and things like that. So I do quite enjoy that. But really for me, and it's slightly odd, that it's a sort of solitary occasion that I'll have it. So I have it in all sorts of occasions, but I suppose if I was to be asked, when do I most appreciate it? I've got an old armchair where I have my bonfire, so a bit like an old tramp, but hopefully the whiskey is of slightly higher quality.
Oh, now I love a glass of whiskey with a fire, a storm raging outside, a guitar in my hand, and a song. I'm under the care of my counsellors, Messrs. Grant and Bell. And if you do just as they say, you're bound to get yourself well. Your mind will ease throughout the day, your legs may well give way. Oh, Messrs. Grant and Bell, I'm happy for to pay. You take the medicine carefully in its liquid form. You must not overdose or you will rue the day you were born. Your spirits start to ease and then you're feeling well, thanks to the ministrations of Messrs. Grant and Bell. It's a terrible thing to say that whiskey rules the day. The doctors will advise you to keep it far away. If you invite them into your house, Grant and Bell will stay. They only need a cupboard for to while away the day. Crystal glasses, plastic cups, a teacup or a mug. For a receptacle to put it in, you should not be stuck. A drop of water is advised, but please no other muck. Drink it down with gusto and you will change your luck. As I end this song, I want to tell a story. The finest whiskey in the world, it comes from Tobermory. Its colours and its textures, formed in bourbon casks. Sip it very gently and in heaven you will bask. Sip it very gently and in heaven you will bask. There's a place for everything and a place for everybody. In the same way that you can make wine in France, you can make it in Italy, in Australia, I still maintain that Scottish whisky will always be top of the league.